People are saying that it's reassuring that younger students are pushing for improvement. I do have to agree. I've been very surprised because I'm like old now, but I've been very surprised. Like every year, there's like more students, and like you know, it always pushes things forward, and it's like really cool to see the movement in, you know, in a better place than it was, you know, not just at least in the same place, which would have been an achievement, but it's like, it's much better. And like, we've got this like big report that's about 2020 curricula, and, you know, people across the world are doing similar things. So it's just super, super encouraging for me. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unlearning Economics. Okay, I have with me Kashvi Singh and Shloka Murarka. Am I saying that right? And they are contributors to and authors of a recent report by Rethinking Economics on whether economics education is fit for the 21st century. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Thanks so much for coming, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So my background in this, just for people listening in case they don't know, I was involved in some similar reports and curriculum research like a decade ago, which makes me feel very old, where we basically were really dissatisfied with our economics education, and we realized that it was very abstract and theoretical. I remember us learning, you know, ISLM diagrams while Greece was literally on fire. It was the height of the Eurozone crisis, and it didn't even get a mention, which is pretty wacky. It's pretty wacky, to be honest. My question to you is that's my experience. That's my most vivid memory from my degree. It's like that ISLM contrast with like what was going on in the Eurozone. For you two, like, do you have like a similar memory? Did you have a similar moment? I'll ask you first, Kashvi.
So I think for me, it's easier now to look back and understand why I was so attracted to the Rethinking Economics movement, because when I study political science and economics, and I've just completed my final year. And when the reason why I wanted to study political science and economics in the first place was because, of course, like as a young person today, you have the climate crisis. There's also the cost of living crisis, and you just want all like some answers to why this is happening. And when I started with my economics education in first year, very similar to what you said, I was just given loads of abstract models, assumptions, so many assumptions, and just a lot of maths as well. And I just couldn't see how this would help me answer any of the questions that I had about the economy or the world today. And at the same time, I came across the Rethinking Economics movement, which to me, it sounded like it had some of the answers. And yeah, I've just been so glad that I found it at the right time.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So can I ask you, you said you did economics and political science. Did you find that political science was a bit better on this front? Do you think that impacted you, contrasting the two subjects?
I think so, yes, because within political science, there was a lot of debate and discussion, and you had all these like contrasting perspectives, and we were encouraged actually to think critically. But that was not the case with economics at all. I think one of the biggest challenges for me was that we were taught economics as a science.
Yeah.
Now, which is not what I was expecting. It's a social science. I was expecting more debate, more critical thinking, which was not the case. So, of course, I think the contrast between the two helped me, just understand.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Economics is kind of presented as a set of truths that you must learn, and there's no questioning it. Whereas almost every other social science, in fact, every other social science, let's be honest, has at least some debate within it. Shloka, what was your experience? Was it similar? Did you study a joint honours or just economics?
I studied just economics, but my experience is quite different because I only applied to SOAS. Like I went into it with the idea that the way economics is being taught generally is not something I'm interested in. I singularly want to go here. I don't want to do any courses on British economics. Don't teach me that. But I mean, the wacky thing is, even at SOAS, you're still learning a lot of ISLM because it has to fit in to the current curriculum. But I often got made fun of for doing rethink because it was like, this is the one place that's doing it right. So why do you still want rethink? Like now you're asking for too much. But I think there's differences in rethink that it's not just about asking the university for curriculum change, it's also about that aspect of student voice. And even if our curriculum was somewhat better, there was a certain degree of accessibility that comes with rethink and students feeling ownership over the curriculum that's quite important. So I think that's why I got drawn to this and was interested in this report.
That's such an interesting answer, actually, because it is, yeah. So in the report itself, you've got 20 universities across the UK, right? And you rank them on a number of metrics, and maybe we'll get into the exact metrics, but it's basically, how much critical thinking is there? How much do they engage with the issues around us? Is there pluralism, right? And, a broad range of skills taught, that kind of thing. But the two that come out on top, they do the best, are Greenwich and SOAS, right? But it's interesting for you to say, well, okay, let's say they scored perfectly. You would still feel a need for something like rethinking economics from a democratic perspective. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, the first event I did was with Hajin Chang, who
Hmm.
wrote the foreword for this report,
Yeah.
and we did an event on how to talk about economics to non-economists, because it's not just about understanding heterodox economics. If you limit yourself to that kind of overly academic space, still there is a barrier. And so even if you're learning the correct or the progressive economics, you need to learn how to actually communicate and talk like a
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I actually find with heterodox economics, sometimes it can be just as bad, if not worse. I mean, I don't know how familiar you guys are with something like the Cambridge Capital controversies, but it was like this long debate over the nature of capital. That went on between kind of what are now regarded as heterodox and mainstream economics in the 60s, and it's just the post Keynesians are still talking about it now. And it's like, I find it interesting, but like if you go out and speak to someone and like you're talking about economic policy, like you're trying to campaign for better policy, change central bank policy, change government policy, whatever, and you start talking about the Cambridge Capital controversies, you're completely detached from anything that's going on. So I think we can all easily get lost in these debates, right? It's a really good point. It's a really valuable point. I mean, what do you think? I mean, but both of you, kind of directed at Shloka, but both of you, like, what do you think the economics profession itself, in absence of rethinking economics, could do to kind of close this gap?
So I currently work at this place called Students Organizing for Sustainability UK, and we're doing like a collaboration with New Economics Foundation. And this is the question we're trying to answer, right? Like Rethink is doing a lot of stuff on the student movement side, but what happens beyond that? What happens, like what role does everyone else play? And so we're trying to create like a body to accredit the curriculum from the outside, to have
Yeah.
this pressure be there, like the bottom up student movement that Rethink is doing very well, and combine it with some more top down pressure. So that's the answer that I've been thinking about a lot. And we're looking at coming in with working with people like the QAA, which is the Quality Assurance Agency, and going in and being like, you have to embed sustainability, ecological economics, inequality
Hmm.
into your curriculum. And that's how you answer like the rest of the questions. Like I think economics as a subject right now is trying to deal with its diversity issue a
Yeah.
lot. Like even in the mainstream circles, there's a lot of debate on
Sure.
how do we get diversity and inclusion? How do we get diversity and inclusion? And it's like maybe diverse students will join if you actually talk about racial inequality, if you actually talk about gender issues, and they feel represented in the diversity of thought. And it goes beyond this kind of like who is teaching me and what they're teaching. So I think we need to like find some consensus of yes, diversity and inclusion, and yes, uh, diversity of thought.
Mm.
And I think that's what the rest of the profession can do. Have some top-down pressure as well.
It's interesting on that point because we often talk about women in economics, right? And that's a campaign that's existed, I think, for perhaps even longer than Rethinking. And the profession still struggles on that front. It really does, despite maybe some progress. But part of it is just like they're not talking about things that concern women, like disproportionately. For example, the classic example is like work done in the home, right? Care work,
Yeah, well,
that kind of thing. Yeah, like childcare, cleaning, and things like that. And that's just not really part of our prevailing economic calculus. It's not. There aren't really that many economic models about it. It's not including GDP, for example. All of these things, and it's like, okay, it's one thing to say, we've got this little advert that's encouraging women to join economics, but it's quite another to say the subject matter needs to be changed entirely.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, just
No, carry
to
on.
add to that, if the aim is to remove like jargon from
Sure.
economics so that we can make it more accessible to the general public, I think we also need to change the way we think about economics, because as long as we treat it as something that's superior to other social sciences, and something that's a hard science, which again goes back to what I was saying before, it's very easy to just eliminate anyone who hasn't formally studied economics. And even for someone like me, I've studied economics as part of my course, but it wasn't until my final year, when I did some optional modules of my choosing, that I realized that, oh, economics is not actually as scary as what we usually perceive it to be. I did economics of development, for example, and there was a lot less jargon and a lot more like real world application, compared to like some of the more like abstract models that we do.
So you talk in this report, and you have this really good abbreviation, MMM, which I can't believe we didn't think of, 10 years ago, which stands for micro, macro, and maths, right? And this accounts for a majority of what's taught in economics degrees on average across the UK, right? And the thing about, if people don't know, the thing about micro and macro in economics is that they're basically just maths anyway. So really, it's just M, right? It's just a load of maths. And it's exactly what you're talking about, right? It's like all of this jargon about, equilibrium and utility maximization, preference orderings, all that kind of stuff. That's, it's very difficult to get into. And at the end of it, you just sort of, you learn to reproduce the maths and solve some of the equations, but you're just left thinking like, why did I do this? Where has this got me? I remember like one of the models is like, they're like, you go through all of this maths in macro, and then at the end they're like, oh, well, if you increase the interest rate, then the economy slows down. And it's like, I already knew that. You didn't need to go through like 20 pages of mathematics. Yeah. So let me ask you about maybe what we should do a little bit, because I think there are two big themes that stand out in the report. I think from the start, you kind of declare them, and it's really interesting. One's decarbonization and one's decolonization. So I think, Shloka, it seems to me that decarbonization is something that you care quite a lot about. So could you explain to us, like, I mean, we all should care, right? But it strikes me that you've contributed to this quite a lot, this part of it. And could you explain to us like what you mean and why mainstream economics kind of fails to properly engage with this idea?
I think a lot of the rhetoric around decarbonization and decolonization has been co-opted. And that's one of the things I enjoyed about the report, is that when it talks about sustainability issues, it talks specifically about ecological issues. Instead of saying anytime you mention the environment, we give you a brownie point. Like you get marks only if you're doing ecological economics, if you're actually saying that the environment exists outside the market logic. I think that's why when it comes to education around decarbonization or decolonization, so even with the new book, you recently had Ingrid on your podcast, I think. And so with the new book on decolonizing econ,
Yeah.
it's about how these movements should not be allowed to be watered down because it's such a step in the wrong direction. I don't think jargon necessarily is what we're fighting against, but like you said, it's the math And these are such basic issues for us to understand, right? Like, yes, we should study about the rest of the world. That's decolonization. We should view knowledge as something that comes from everywhere. And instead of these, like, only old Oxford textbooks are allowed to produce knowledge. And so I think it's as simple as that when it comes to academic decolonization. And similarly for decarbonization, it's about what actually reduces our emissions. And we don't have to succumb to the very base. Like recently, someone said, "Oh, let's not talk about ideology. Let's just talk about growth." And I'm like, no, growth is ideological. And so with decarbonization, I think it's about not taking it as implicit that we have to grow and we have to grow a certain way, and actually just sitting and challenging these ideas and looking at why we don't have to have emissions and why we don't have to have emissions in a way that allow us to like kind of donut economic style. We're allowed to live, we have to live within our planetary boundaries, or even accepting the possibility of degrowth. Like maybe we have enough. So to me, decarbonization is about going beyond that market framework. And being a lot like within that, there's so many different ones, right? Donut and degrowth don't agree with each other either, but just
No.
having that morality.
Yeah, absolutely. Who said that thing about growth? Sorry.
No, like a student in like
Just a
my
student.
classmates.
Okay, right.
Yeah, was like,
Okay.
okay, you guys are getting into an argument. Let's stop talking about it. Let's just like talk about how we would increase GDP. I think it was actually in a conversation about care work. My own work is not decarbonization. Sorry if that was a bad answer. I do
Oh
more
no,
like
no.
feminist Marxist social reproduction.
Okay, right. I think I for some reason I interpreted you as working on decarbonisation. Maybe I was wrong. It's funny because that comment about growth from the student echoes, William Nordhaus, who made the who won the Nobel Prize for his kind of climate economics, and which states that I think a 4-degree rise in centigrade will impact global GDP by like -2% or something stupid. But he said after he won it, he was like, right, let's get back to focusing on economic growth. And I just thought that was such a mad thing for probably anyone to say, but for someone who's literally about the environment, it's like, surely he should have said, let's get back to focusing on the environment. But then it just shows you where the priorities of the discipline lie, right? So, I mean, so Kashvi, like, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so just to give an example, so we have at UCL, we have the core project, which is like a new textbook that was launched a few years back. And the aim with this new textbook and the whole project was to make economics education and teaching more sustainability focused and more like inclusive, more applicable to real world. But a lot of these things, as Shloka mentioned, was just still serving like like neoclassical models that we have in place. And just one of the key findings of the report as well is just ecological issues are ignored, and also that the environment is treated as an externality. So yeah, that what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the times, even when professors recognize that these are the problems and we need a curriculum that's more focused on sustainability, for example, a lot of this is still just within the framework of growth and within neoclassical models rather than challenging.
I think also we can't talk about decarbonization and decolonization separately. Like, if we actually decolonize to any extent, we realize that decarbonization is the most primary need, right? Like, I'm from India, I'm an international student here, and the climate crisis over here is still spoken about to a certain extent in the future tense of if we don't do this, this will happen. Whereas if you go back home, you're feeling all those effects right now. And so if you start decolonizing, you start realizing the urgency of the situation. And in other ways, you also find other solutions, right? Like there's a lot of like green practices that happen here that are ancient practices or like traditional practices. So I think those conversations are very interlinked.
I mean, the relationship between inequality and climate change is undeniable, right? Like the global rich are by a very long way the most pollutive, and then the richest within each country are as well, right? So it's like you can't untangle these conversations. I don't think, not at all. So I wanted to ask something a little bit more direct about the report, and I don't want to I don't want to put you on the spot here, but having working at LSE, right, and having also researched LSE's curriculum and looked at the course outlines and the exams personally, when we were doing the iconocracy, you have 4 categories, right? And I forget what they're called, but I think the first one's like economics for the 21st century, like suitable. That's Greenwich and SOAS. Then the next one is like something like just about making it or something like that.
In need of a wake-up call.
In need of a wake-up call. That's better than what I said. But that one's like the second highest, and LSE's in it. Now I don't know how closely involved you were with but what is it? Has LSE improved since I did my review? Is it like okay now, or I was just very surprised because it's so mathematical that education.
I think LSE is and very much continues to be the core of neoliberal economics in the world. In fact, I applied there now for my master's just because I was like, if I have to leave SOAS and I have to do neoliberal economics, maybe do it at the center of it and like learn what I'm challenging. I'm not going, but
Oh,
I did apply and they came back to me and I've done well in all the SOAS level math,
yeah.
like particularly well, but they just don't want anybody who they think can't do math. Like they don't care about any other metric of your qualifications. They came back to me saying, send us a list of your math textbooks. I was like, this is insane. You think nobody from SOAS can do any math? And so there is very much that hegemony of LSE. I think the reason it ends up here is because optional modules are considered. And I think that's one of the issues, perhaps, or something we can work on in the future, that we need to look at curriculum that's embedded as differently from curriculum that's not. And LSE has some interesting optional modules.
I mean, we did like the core modules separately in the iconocracy. We like rated them separately, but it's not really a criticism because it's just producing any type of evidence like this is so fraught with difficulties. And if you did it one way, then it would could be criticized as well, and you do it another way, and then also there's an issue of length. Like the report's also quite long, so if you added what I talked about, a separate thing for the core modules, would probably be like 40% longer again. So it's just but I think that makes sense. There are probably some nice elective modules on like economic history and stuff at LSE. Actually, has quite a good economic history. Yeah, and it's also got that what's it called? That general purpose social sciences intro for first years. Does it still have that?
I was looking for masters, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I mean, the econ history department is pretty good.
Yeah.
And geography as well. And I think that's something that's considered in the report. And I think. And then again, like the economic history, though, is relatively European history.
Yeah, of course.
They also have labor economics, development economics. Now, what's taught within that labor economics and development economics is not necessarily the most progressive, but it is there.
It is. At least it's engaging with an issue you would recognize as economics, right? Like, in terms of like, you want to study labor, like you can see people going, okay, right, I'm studying labor. At least, we've reached the bare minimum.
I also think it's a roundabout issue of because they have so many students and so much money, they're able to have more of these electives.
Yes, they have a lot of money. And none of it goes to their staff on a short-term contracts. I can tell you that much from personal experience. Kashvi, you unmuted. Sorry, we should let you come in here.
No, I was just gonna add regarding. So I think UCL was also in the same category as LSE, and I personally wasn't involved with writing the national report. Like I was more on the UCL side, UCL report. But I do think it's a simplification of just like dividing like different universities based on like a comparative scale rather than like an overall scale saying that UCL or LSE is doing well.
is you've got to look at the other one. You've got to realize how bad the other ones are.
Yeah,
You're right.
exactly.
The ones at the bottom. What's the bottom category called?
Shloka.
What is
Dead
it?
and buried.
Dead and buried. I liked the
Oh,
category names.
yes.
I remember. Yeah, the bottom category is dead and buried. So maybe we should name and shame who's in that one.
Honestly, the one that surprised me was category 3, stuck in the past.
Oh yeah.
I think what's interesting is where the universities position themselves, like, or where they think they're positioned versus where they end up. And so Leeds ending up here, which in more casual conversation I've always seen described as a relatively heterodox department.
Ah,
See that
yes.
here was a bit surprising.
Yes, Leeds is there, and people say Leeds is pluralist and heterodox, and it has quite a few heterodox economists. Leeds,
It
but
definitely does. Yeah.
yeah, but that again speaks to this point, and I mean, there is to extend some sympathy to the academics themselves. There's this kind of lock-in, isn't there? There's this like, because if you were like, you went in pretty much any university, you went up to, I don't know, the head of department or the dean or whatever, or even the students or the parents. You were like, I'm not going to teach demand and supply. I'm not going to teach utility maximization or production functions or ISLM. Right. People would just be like, what? Like, that's mad. Like, then there's a whole sort of progression, right, from up to the next modules and then to, master's level or whatever, right? And your students are not going to be able to progress up that ladder, right? So it's something that just needs like a big push. It can't all come from just the local level, I don't think.
Definitely. And I've spoken to one of the course directors for BSc Economics, and she had a similar concern with like what we were trying to do is that we can't compromise the like for students for their careers, it's important for them to. I think there's also the sense of competition amongst universities, which kind of prevents any change. So similar to what Shloka said with her like master's application.
Yeah, and with the rankings and generally speaking, you might say, I mean, I don't know if you can actually infer this from your results specifically, but typically the higher ranked the university according to traditional tables, probably the more neoclassical it is, the more mathematical it is, as a rough rule of thumb. I'd say. So there's that, and that means more funding, more prestige, and everything like that, right? So there's this whole mess of crap that we have to contend with that goes to the root of like how we view higher education and what we expect from an economics degree.
I think it's interesting because the report actually doesn't say that at all, right? Because Cambridge, LSE, and UCL end up in category 2. So it's not like the more neoclassical, the lower it's been ranked.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Then the more expected result, right?
Yeah,
But
that
that's
was our result, but maybe that's changed. Yeah.
But I think because Cambridge, LSE, UCL are more able to respond to what students want because they have the money to do so, they have that applicant pool, and they're able to just put everything as optional modules, right? Whereas University of West England, which is in the same category, has that same intellectual diversity, but it's a lot more reflected in its mandatory modules.
Should we talk about these improvements then? Because you do discuss like some of what you think's changed and some of the positive things in general, not just at SOAS and Greenwich, in the report. So, if when we did our research, there really was nothing on the real world at all or data. Right, you didn't do anything on data gathering, and you get the sense that, especially with like the core curriculum, that seems to have changed. Right, am I right in that?
Yeah, I
think
would
so.
say
Go on,
so.
Shloka.
No, Kashvi, go.
No, I was just saying in terms of data, yes, there is more focus on like research methods now, especially even compulsory modules for like the BSc economics students. So research is something that I mean, I'm not sure how exactly it was during your time, but now there is a lot of emphasis on research. And optional modules, especially, we do have a real world application. Which Shloka, go on.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's definitely more real issues. Like, it's shocking to hear you say that like the Greek economy was not discussed while you're at university. I don't think that happens to the same extent now. I think that's also a consequence of like the digital age where everyone's a lot more in touch with the world
Mm.
and you have to kind of keep up with that. It's also a function of there being more international students and you're actually talking about the international economy a little bit more. So I think real world issues are there, research methods are there. But again, the research methods are a little more quantitative, almost exclusively, and the qualitative ones haven't made it in. I think there's discussion of sustainability. It's just the way it's spoken about is different. Similar with inequality, it kind of stays at income inequality, and we don't look at the kind of intersecting inequalities that need to be looked at. So there is progress, and it's just really not enough for where we are now.
I find that I always found back when we were campaigning that they're exactly the things that you've described, the things that have changed are exactly the things that the economists would say, yeah, okay, we think you've got a point here. They would say, okay, I understand that we don't reference the Eurozone crisis, and that's pretty wacky when it's going on, right? They'd say, oh, economists in a lot of their research are basically kind of applied statisticians. There's lots of quantitative stuff out there, right? And some of it's good and worthwhile, but they'd be happy to bring that into the classroom a bit more. But where they would draw the line is this kind of pluralism, I think, and debating and discussing different schools of thought on an equal footing, taking them seriously, taking interdisciplinarity seriously. I think that they were always reluctant to do that. So it doesn't surprise me that that's the front. They've got environmental economics. Maybe there's more environmental economics, but there's not ecological economics, like you said, Shloka, right? It does seem like that's just the red line, and it's really difficult for us to kind of change that.
And there's a conversation to be had around if that's counterintuitive or productive. Like the fact that they get away with including environmental economics. Is that actually in the favor of this more new economy perspective? Or does it go against what we want? Because it's like, if there is this degree of reform, they get away with saying, we already have it. We don't need any more of it. And so the number one recommendation that the report actually makes is to change the way that students are introduced to the discipline of economics. And I think that resonates with what you're saying on math. So I've worked for a lot of the SOAS open days, where students come and decide if they want to apply or if they want to accept the offers they have. And they prep you with like, oh, these are the different questions you might get. But the only question I've ever gotten is how much math is there? How difficult is the math? If I've not done math, can I do the course? Like exclusively, the questions are around math. So I think people's perception of the subject really matters when you're starting.
Yeah. I think also going back to like the perception of the professors and where they're willing to draw the line, I think it's also a fundamental difference in what we as we thinkers perceive as economics and what economics should be, and their view of economics. Like they seem to have this more narrow view of if there's no maths, it's not economics. So,
Yeah. I mean, I fundamentally agree with you. I do think that the first cut is the deepest, right? And I think when you introduce students to economics with abstract diagrams and maths and assumptions and stuff, they're like, oh, this is economics. Because I don't think anybody really knows what economics is when they're like 16 or whatever, right? Like sort of like, oh, it's kind of like, I don't know, the stock market or whatever. And so people don't know. So you really have to, have an impact on them with what you first teach. And I've always thought that you should really lead with issues, right? It seems to me that like, the issue should be the environment, right? Or climate change, perhaps more narrowly, and then, different approaches to that. But I think you should start with sort of a basic, more historical perspective on every issue. Economic growth as well would be another one, like a separate one. And, I don't actually particularly like the demarcation between micro and macroeconomics. I don't actually think that's very useful, to be honest with you. And I think that there's this thing that comes back in this report and in a lot of other stuff that Rethinking have produced over the years and rethinking adjacent people, this idea of thinking like an economist, right? You see this, you use this phrase a lot in the report. And I think it's really important because I do think, and you go to course outlines and the websites of the universities, they're like, we're teaching students how to think like an economist. And it's really interesting, that distinction, because we're not teaching them to think about the economy. We're not teaching them to, we're not learning about specific issues. It's like a way of thinking. And that's very, very strange. I don't think any other subject really does that. And it just shows you how narrow it is.
Well, economics is always a science when it's convenient for it to be a science, and it's always a social science when it's convenient for it to be a social science. So, for example, in the work that we're doing, like we've discussed a lot about why economics acts like a science, in that it's isolated from the other disciplines, it relies on math, it acts as if everything it's saying is true, it doesn't focus on its history, which is shocking. But then it acts like a social science when it comes to things like regulation. So all the science subjects we learn are regulated at a university level, they're accredited. But when it comes to economics, it's like, no, we're a social science. Why do we need to be accredited? Let us teach what we want to teach. So it picks and chooses what works for it.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's really interesting. It's very selective. So I was okay. So one issue I have with this is like you make a whole bunch of recommendations, right? And we've touched on some of them here, but basically, kind of decolonizing, decarbonization, diversifying as well, pluralism, and more critical engagement, more real world engagement. All of these things that I think are really good. I tend to agree with them. Now, there is one counterpoint which usually comes back when you start saying stuff like this, which is that this is too much, right? We don't have the room. It's one of those things, it gets used in a disingenuous way. On the other hand, having designed university courses, there is often a lot you want to put in there that you can't. And like, there is a limit, right? So how do you think about this? Like, you guys, how do you navigate this?
I think, like from UCL perspective, when we were writing the report, our aim, like we had to balance between being strategic and being like too ambitious. And this is something that was an ongoing debate between us and rethinking like the national report. And so we were saying that we want to be more strategic because we actually want to take this report and we want to have some change come out of it. Like we want to be able to take this to the department and them taking it seriously enough. If it's too ambitious, they're going to be like, they're not going to take it seriously. So, but I think the way we handled that was we had short-term recommendations as well as long-term recommendations for the UCL report specifically. And within the short-term recommendations, it's like low-hanging fruits, easy changes that the department can make. So there's already a lot of optional modules. So we use that sort of match the line of thinking or some real world application. So we tried to use that as one of the ways in which we could get some of the things onto the curriculum, some of our like key demands. Within the long-term recommendations, there was the more ambitious like structural change and I think regarding the point on that the department doesn't have the capacity or they can't change this much, I don't think it's true because as we've seen in UCL, we've had the core project, the core textbook, and there's ongoing revisions as well. I think this year there's been a completely new textbook, which is this is for first year students. Like a complete revision of the first core textbook.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of changes ongoing. I don't see it as I think it's more of a problem of will rather than like practical changes.
I think that's very interesting. And well, curriculum design is something that that's all we're thinking about. But when you speak about the micro macro division as well, I think there's boundaries of what universities are able to do because other universities are not doing them. But there is that little bit of first mover advantage that they can get if they want to. I think Open University is currently designing a program where they do one without the micro macro division, which will be really exciting to see if they end up doing that. And I think when it comes to space and the question of we can't teach everything, Actually, like I agree with that. But I'm not arguing for a horizontal plurality where you just teach everything, right? Like give a little bit of less space to the things that are there now. It's not just tacking on additional things, right? We can't be teaching ecological economics alongside the market economics of the environment. And there needs to be some plurality and some interdisciplinarity as part of that, but it can't be just adding things on. And I think it's often seen as heterodox as something that you're just adding on to orthodox instead of it actually getting space instead of it. And well, the radical argument is to just give it a little bit less space, and that's how everyone will fit in there. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think it also depends on the suitability of the department. Like Kashvi mentioned, the kind of low-hanging fruit. If we have to ask for small wins at the beginning, we have to see what the staff in that department are trained to teach. That's often a problem cited by universities, that we don't have someone who would teach this feminist economics. And it's like, yes, it's a secondary problem that they need to hire people to teach that feminist economics. But at first, at least, okay, if you have someone on the environment, at least have this embedded in your course. So I think, yeah, some departments are suitable to some things. And lastly, I think there's a demand model to university education in the UK that's not working, in the sense that universities are going bankrupt and don't have money. But at the same time, if this is what students want out of their curriculum,
Yeah.
it's in their favor to give it, right? Like they'll get most students. So it's in the advantage of universities to listen. And exactly, it's a problem of will where, or maybe it's a problem of proof. Maybe heterodoxy has failed to prove that students actually want this. And yes, employability is a thing, but I mean, employers want students to come out with green skills as well now. Like the biggest job search, the most search jobs on LinkedIn are with green skills and climate skills. So I think if employers want this and students want this, then the university sector in a way just needs to catch up, and it would be to their advantage to catch up.
Yeah, I think also going back to what you said about like maybe the departments aren't clear on that this is what students want. I think one thing is that there isn't enough consensus among students, and maybe they're not as aware about what the problems are. Like I feel like most of like my econs peers that I've spoken to, um, when you talk to them, they do realize that, okay, yes, this is a problem that we've felt as well, but they don't know what the alternative to that is, because this is what they've been taught economics is. So for the first 2 years that we launched our campaign at UCL, our focus was just to improve awareness about the movement among students, so that there's some kind of consensus between students, so that we can then speak to the department, tell them that, this is what most students want.
It's
Yeah.
funny that you're at UCL, because there was an organization called Better Economics at UCL. I don't know if you've heard of it. You might not even, but it was one of the first ones when we first formed Rethinking Economics, and it obviously fell by the wayside because it's just tricky, right? You're there for 3 years, right? And it probably takes you a year to discover it. For a start, and then you're sort of looking elsewhere. At the end of your third year, you're probably more focused on your exams and stuff. So it's very fleeting, really, this moment. And then you see Better Economics UCL. They were very enthusiastic, but they obviously fell by the wayside, and you had to launch UCL Rethinking, right? And that's just, it speaks to this difficulty of like, how do we keep this going and educate students and show them, you can put on events to show alternatives. We did that at Post Crash Manchester. It was like, we did a whole pluralist series that was like ecological, Marxist, feminist, whatever, like a different lecture. And then people went to them and they're like, oh, right, yeah, you can actually do things another way. But it's like, it's very right. It's very tricky. You're right.
Yeah,
Even I had to restart the Rethinking Society at SOAS because we kind of skipped a year and then you have to reaffiliate. And yeah, it's been a big like training the kind of next students who can try to take on, because it's really hard to anchor something to this undergraduate or master's students.
Yeah, I think with me as well, because we started like 2 years back, and one of my main focuses was that I wanted the movement to continue even after I left. And luckily, we have like a group of enthusiastic and like capable students now who are taking it forward. So UCL should be good for the next few years at least.
Yeah, it is good. And you've got obviously the umbrella organization Rethinking. So for anybody listening who doesn't really understand all of these organization names, Rethinking Economics is actually a registered charity, and it like has paid employees who work for it, and they act as an umbrella organization to help out and facilitate the student groups that tend to arise at each university, right? And they provide them with resources and knowledge and kind of support of various kinds to stop it from fizzling out. But I mean, in terms of student movements, it's lasted longer than any of the other ones, because there was one in the 60s with the Vietnam War protests. There were also protests about economics. There was the French one in like the 90s and noughties. There's been quite a few, but they all kind of fizzle out. But this one doesn't seem to have, right? We're still producing reports and stuff, and we'll continue banging on about it for as long as it's a problem.
For as long as it's a problem is optimistic. I
Yeah,
never
yeah.
think in those terms. I don't think there'll ever be a point where we're like, okay, everything's perfect.
No, there won't be. And what you said at the start about the democratization of economic knowledge is really important as well, because I think that's, even if the curriculum were much, much better, there would still be room for improvement on the curriculum, but also there's this like keeping in touch with students and stuff. And I think, in that sense, let me ask you a big question. Do you think this can kind of go beyond economics?
Curriculum change?
Yeah, like the campaign for curriculum change, for changing universities. In the report, right, let me take an example, a concrete example. You talk about like the colonial legacy of universities in the UK, right, which is pretty clear. And SOAS, although it has this progressive reputation, was actually, kind of a colonial institution in the first place to study Asia and Africa, right? Like that was the idea. So there's a lot of these quite deep-seated problems, and I just wonder if this campaign to kind of, further, decolonize, decarbonize, diversify, and pluralize. Don't know if that's a nice word. And democratize. I don't know. Like, I'm not asking you to do it, but I'm just saying, do you think that, this has broader applicability? Are we bumping up against something that's a bit bigger here?
100%. So for 6 months at SOAS, I worked at the SOAS library on a project they have a project called Decolonizing the library. And so the SOAS library is known for being very decolonial. And yes, it comes from this place of it used to be the colonial center to teach languages. And so it still has a good languages program. But the idea is now, how do we decolonize the library, and how do we decolonize student reading lists? Now, that's not something limited to economics. I was told I could do whatever subject I want, and so of course I did economics. But you can look at that from any perspective, and often decoloniality and reading lists comes as who are you reading, not where it's been published. And so I try to focus on independent publishing. And again, this is something not related to any subject matter, right? It's just about if we're only reading books published at certain places, there's automatically a power hierarchy of who is getting read. So even if it is a black person, a brown person, a woman, it's still people who have gained some degree of mainstream legitimacy and are not challenging something very radically to the extent that people don't want to publish them. So a lot of independent publishing, self-publishing gets cut out of the conversation. And so I think that's one avenue for decolonizing that's not anchored to any subject.
Yeah, I think like from a strategic perspective, the momentum for rethinking economics comes directly from the problems that students face, while like the problems that we can like visibly identify we have with our curriculum. So in that sense, the movement could be expanded to any discipline which has a lot of these problems. So like decolonization, for example. If it is a problem with a certain discipline, then certainly it can be expanded. But I think, yeah, that momentum needs to be there amongst the students.
I don't know how much YouTube you guys watch, but there's a YouTuber, a physicist called Dr. Fatima, who is who talks a lot about decolonization and physics, right? And she makes a number of points about how science isn't necessarily neutral, but also just the simple point that like there's this massive telescope in Hawaii, which I think is where she's from, and it was just sort of built on indigenous land, right? It's like I think it might be the world's biggest telescope, or it's coming up, or it's planned, or something like that, right? And it's like the positivist sort of neutral scientific narrative would be great. We've got a telescope, we can see more stuff, but it's like, well, wait a minute, look at where it is, right? You can't escape these kinds of debates in any subject, even physics, which is the most positivist subject possible, in my opinion.
And I think this is reflected in the attendance of our events as well. Even our committee wasn't just economic students for
Yeah.
Rethink. So there's definitely interest in other subjects. Our committee had students from history, development, politics.
Well, Lawrence is a physicist by background, the head of Rethinking Economics.
Really?
Yeah, and we had a sociologist in our committee, and a couple of people, yeah, who are from outside economics. Economics adjacent, obviously, but there was this broad interest, and I think it's because economics kind of matters to everyone, and I think that as well, if you're talking about something like sociology, right, they do study the economy in sociology. Of course they do. Of course there's, sociology / economics, or economic sociology, right? So it's like it kind of, for the discipline of economics to have a monopoly on these debates is a problem in itself, right? So that's where probably these other students come at it from. People are saying that it's reassuring that younger students are pushing for improvement. I do have to agree. I've been very surprised because I'm like old now, but I've been very surprised. Like every year, there's like more students, and like it always pushes things forward, and it's like really cool to see the movement in in a better place than it was, not just at least in the same place, which would have been an achievement, but it's like, it's much better. And like, we've got this like big report that's about 20 curricula, and, people across the world are doing similar things. So it's just super, super encouraging for me.
It's encouraging for us to have people like you who are adults writing books who are not kind of jaded. Like, even if you're angry at the system, you're not completely jaded and believe the change is possible.
Yeah.
Because I've also spoken to professors who are like, why are you wasting your time with this? Nobody's going to listen. Because the work we're doing is to a certain extent having a conversation and like trying to push for legitimacy. We're not saying that we want to exist on the fringe and continue teaching radical things in only
Yeah.
radical spaces. We're saying we want to be a part of the big conversation. And so I think often people go like, yeah, okay, do heterodox economics and be read by other heterodox economists. And I think that's really unfair to say to students who maybe we'll get tired at some point, and I get that we'll be more disillusioned, but it's not fair to be so jaded at the beginning. And so it's nice to have support from adults.
Definitely. And the inspiration that like we can change economics from within as well. So, for example, when I was reading Donut Economics, like that was the first time I felt that, oh, like people like me could actually belong within economics rather than, just people who have this certain acceptance of what the field already is. So yeah, it's always good to have that inspiration.
Yeah, I'm glad. So I was just laughing at as being described as an adult. That was what tickled me. But no, and it's like that's the purpose of like rethinking economics as well. Like the big organization, it's like because you can feel quite alone with these things, and with your concerns, and maybe they're not shared by other students. But even if you get together, you're sort of like you're going against a bunch of full-blown professors who have been studying the subject for longer than you've been alive, and they'll be like, look, there's no alternative, this is the way we do things. And when you even have access to something like donut economics, right, like a book like that, and you're like, oh, hold on a minute, no, there's a whole world out there of different ideas that you don't know about, Mr. Professor, right? So it's like it's really, really vital. And it's just, it kind of makes me a bit sad when I think about like an economics student who just kind of really doesn't like it and just sort of like gets their head down and just gets through it and like is never introduced to this. But that seems less and less likely with all of the fuss that you guys are kicking up.
I mean, Rethink is also exactly that, right? Like there's the previous Rethinkers who are making space in other places. And it was nice to see a lot of them show up for the Rethink curriculum launch.
Yeah.
Like Yan Yang was there and Ben Pringle was there. And it was like, oh, they're just working in these like government spaces now. And they're still so connected with the student movement. And that's what makes you feel like, okay, I can go on and have a normal job and still push for this kind of work.
Yeah, we have infiltrated the government now. Yuan is actually an MP, and Ben works for the government, and a whole load of rethinkers work for the government. Chris Wills from Post Crash works for the Bank of England. There's people in the IMF and stuff like that. Yeah, the operation is progressing. So can I ask you? Have you both graduated now? Am I right in saying that?
Well, I've not gotten the graduation certificate.
Sorry, yeah,
I just got my dissertation grade.
Jumping the gun. Have you finished studying?
Yes.
Is what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So what are you doing next?
Shloka?
I'm going to do EPOG, which is Economic Policies for Global Transition. It's a Erasmus program, and it's one of the only heterodox economics masters you can do. So you pick your pathways. They have 3 pathways: technology, like digital innovation, socioeconomics, and like international macro. And so I'm going to do the international macro pathway. So I'll be there in Berlin for a year, Paris for 6 months, and then 6 months I get to pick where I do my dissertation. And it's a really incredible program in that like it's a completely full ride scholarship. So they charge no fees, no stipend, and it's really just like, okay, go do some heterodox research. So I feel quite lucky.
Yeah, that sounds all right. That does.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, actually. I will be taking some distance from economics in the near future. So
I get it.
So I am going back to India, and I'm joining this organization called Janagraha, and it's a movement, and they work on reforming urban systems, so through local level governance. So yeah, it's a pretty important movement, I think, and I'm excited to join that.
I mean, you're taking a break from economics, the discipline, but you're not taking a break from economics, right? You're doing it. You're doing it. Yeah, absolutely. No, I believe really strongly in those kind of those kind of local solutions. I think that they're not everything, but definitely they're an area where we can feel like we have a stake in the economy and control over it and power to change things. Sometimes more than horrible debates about Donald Trump or whatever that feel a bit more up in the air. Cool. So excellent. So yeah, so this report is Economics Education Fit for the 21st Century. Is such a valuable update. It's really great to see how the student movement is still going and how it's transformed, and perhaps not so great to see how economics education still kinds of sucks. But as I said, we'll keep complaining until it doesn't. So thanks so much for joining me, you two.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Learned a lot from you. Thank you.
See you.